There was a time when work was not a career. It was survival. For millions of people, work meant placing their lives at risk every single day. It meant uncertainty, fear, and constant danger. Factories were loud, chaotic, and unforgiving places. Machines moved relentlessly. Time was measured not in hours, but in output. There were no safety rules, no protective equipment, no warning signs. No one explained how machines worked. No one taught workers how to protect themselves. Mistakes were paid for with bodies. Every morning, workers left their homes with silent goodbyes. Families understood the risk. They lived with it. For employers, labor was replaceable. For workers, it was everything. Before rules existed, before responsibility, before protection, there were accidents. In the late 18th century, the world entered a period of irreversible change. The Industrial Revolution altered not only how goods were produced, but how societies were structured. Handcraft was replaced by mechanization. Small workshops disappeared. Factories grew larger and more powerful. Steam engines enabled continuous production. Cities expanded rapidly, absorbing rural populations. Industry promised progress, but progress came without safeguards. Speed became the priority. Efficiency replaced caution. Profit overshadowed human life. Factories were constructed faster than laws could be written. Technology advanced faster than ethics. Workers became part of the machine. Inside early factories, danger was not occasional. It was constant. Machines operated without guards. Belts spun freely across open spaces. Gears rotated inches away from human bodies. Noise was overwhelming. Communication was difficult. Warnings were impossible. A moment of distraction was enough. Loose clothing could be caught. A hand could disappear. There were no emergency stop systems, no standardized training, no inspections. If a worker collapsed from exhaustion, work continued. If someone was injured, the machine did not stop. Factories treated injuries as interruptions, deaths as inconveniences. Accidents were expected outcomes. Children were drawn into this system early. They worked alongside adults, often longer hours, often under harsher conditions. Their small size made them useful. Their obedience made them controllable. Factories relied on children to clean machines while they were running. Mines sent children into narrow tunnels. Many children were permanently injured. Many were killed. Education was a luxury. Survival was the priority. Child labor was visible everywhere. It was normalized. Mines were not just workplaces. They were underground traps. Deep below the surface, workers entered a world without light, without air, and without certainty. The deeper they went, the more dangerous it became. There was no ventilation, no gas detection, no warning systems. Explosive gases accumulated silently. Coal dust filled the air. Wooden supports creaked under pressure. Every shift began with risk. Every step forward could be the last. A single spark was enough. One mistake could ignite an explosion that traveled faster than sound, consuming everything in its path. Entire tunnels collapsed in seconds. Men were buried alive. Some were never recovered. Rescue efforts were slow and unorganized. Equipment was limited. Plans did not exist. Families waited at the surface, often for days, often for nothing. Many miners were not officially recorded. When they died, there were no names, no reports, no compensation. Production did not stop. Coal-powered factories, Coal-fueled cities. Coal mattered more than lives. Mining disasters became common. Explosions, collapses, poisonous gas leaks. Each incident followed the same pattern: shock, grief, silence. Investigations were rare. Responsibility was avoided. Owners blamed fate. Governments blamed progress. Workers were told that danger was part of the job. But mines were not the only places of disaster. Factories burned. Poorly designed buildings trapped workers inside. Locked doors prevented escape. Narrow staircases turned into death corridors. Fire spread rapidly through wooden floors, oil-soaked machinery, and fabric-filled rooms. These were not accidents. They were consequences. Consequences of neglect. Consequences of profit-driven decisions. Mines and factories forced society to confront an uncomfortable truth. Work should not be a death sentence. Eventually, silence broke. For years, deaths had been ignored. Injuries had been normalized. Danger had been accepted as part of work. But the losses became impossible to hide. Families began to ask questions. Not quietly, not privately. They demanded explanations. They demanded responsibility. Newspapers published names. Journalists described conditions inside factories and mines. Images of destroyed workplaces reached the public. For the first time, danger had witnesses. Stories spread beyond factory walls, beyond mining towns, beyond local communities. Society began to understand that these deaths were not isolated incidents. They were patterns. Workers organized. Unions formed. Meetings were held in secret, then in public. Voices that had been silent began to speak together. The question was simple, yet revolutionary. Should work cost human lives? This question challenged long-standing beliefs. Industry claimed progress required sacrifice. Governments argued change would slow growth, but families knew the truth. Progress without protection was not progress. Public pressure grew. Protests filled streets. Petitions reached lawmakers. Investigations were demanded. For the first time, employers were questioned. For the first time, responsibility was discussed. Slowly, laws began to appear. Not comprehensive, not perfect, but real. Regulations introduced limits to working hours. Minimum safety requirements were written. Inspections were authorized. These reforms did not come from compassion. They came from pressure. Each law carried the memory of disaster. Each regulation followed a tragedy. Safety was no longer optional. It became a social demand. Yet resistance remained. Many employers ignored rules. Many governments enforced them weakly. Change was uneven. Progress was slow. But the direction was set. The idea that human life mattered had entered law. Society had drawn a line. Work would no longer be allowed to silently consume lives. Reform had begun. Safety did not appear suddenly. It was not invented in a laboratory. It was not designed in comfort. Safety was born out of loss, out of funerals, out of ruined families, out of names written in newspapers. For decades, dangers had been accepted as unavoidable. Workplaces were built for production, not protection. Efficiency mattered more than survival. But after countless disasters, society reached a breaking point. The first safety measures were simple: emergency exits, fire escapes, basic ventilation. They were not advanced, they were not sophisticated, but they saved lives. For the first time, governments began to intervene, not as observers, but as regulators. Laws introduced limits to working hours. Child labor was restricted. Basic protections became mandatory. these laws were resisted. Factory owners warned of economic collapse. Mine operators predicted shutdowns. Industry claimed safety would destroy progress. But progress without safety had already destroyed too much. Slowly, the idea of responsibility took shape. Employers were no longer free to ignore danger. Governments were no longer allowed to look away. Inspections were introduced. Standards were written. Violations carried consequences. The concept of prevention was revolutionary. For the first time, the goal was not to respond after death, but to prevent it. Protective equipment began to appear: helmets, gloves, masks. At first, they were crude, uncomfortable, often ignored, but they represented something new: the recognition that human life mattered. Safety training followed. Warning signs appeared. Procedures were documented. Workplaces slowly changed. Not everywhere, not evenly, but unmistakably. Each new rule carried a history. Each standard was linked to a tragedy. Safety regulations were written in response to failure. They were lessons learned the hardest way possible. By the early 20th century, safety had become a discipline. Engineers studied risk. Governments collected data. Accidents were analyzed, not ignored. The language of safety emerged: hazards, risk, prevention. Words that did not exist before now shaped how work was done. Safety was no longer about fate. It was about choice. And that choice saved lives. Every safety rule has a history, not a theoretical history, not an abstract one, a human history. Behind every regulation, there is a moment when something went wrong: a machine that did not stop, a tunnel that collapsed, a fire that spread too fast. Every helmet exists because someone once struck their head. Every guardrail exists because someone once fell. Every warning sign exists because someone once was not warned. Safety was not born from innovation alone. It was born from reflection, from societies looking back and admitting mistakes. For a long time, accidents were treated as inevitable, unavoidable, unquestioned. Today, we know better. We understand that accidents are rarely random. They are the result of choices, of priorities, of systems. Safety is not the absence of danger. It is the presence of responsibility. It lives in planning, in training, in preparation. It exists in moments when work stops because something feels wrong. That pause is the legacy of those who did not survive. Modern workplaces may look different. Machines are smarter. Technology is advanced. But the risks remain. What has changed is our willingness to confront them. Safety culture did not emerge overnight. It was built step by step, rule by rule, lesson by lesson, and it continues to evolve. Every generation inherits both the protection and the responsibility. To remember why these rules exist, to question complacency, to refuse shortcuts, because safety is fragile. When it is ignored, history repeats itself, and when it is respected, lives are saved. Safety is not a barrier to progress. It is the foundation of it. The stories of the past are not meant to frighten us. They are meant to remind us that behind every safe workplace today stand countless unnamed workers who never returned home. Safety was not given. It was earned, and it must be protected.